We have 3 more speakers now. In this order will be Isabelle Duvernois, the Associate Conservator in Paintings Conservation from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Isabelle will be followed by a presentation by Carol Stringari, who's Deputy Director and Chief Conservator at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York City. Even though Carol will be giving the presentation, it's a co-authored paper with Luciano Pensabene, who is in the audience somewhere, who's conservator at the Peggy Guggenheim Collection in Venice. And then finally, we'll have Susan Lake, Dr. Susan Lake, who is Chief Conservator and Director of Collections, Care and Management at the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden in Washington, D.C. So, Isabelle, welcome.
Good morning. I wanted to thank the Getty Research Institute for bringing us together today to talk and share our works, experience, and thoughts about Jackson Pollock. This is a great opportunity. Thank you. Pasofi is among the 10 paintings or so Jackson Pollock set out to complete for his very first solo show to open on November 9th, 1943 at Peggy Guggenheim's Art of the Century Gallery on West 57th Street. He also has set out to complete Mural, his very first commission, to be installed in Peggy's townhouse on East 61st Street on time for the opening for the show. While numerous conflicting records and recollections exist about exactly when Pollock started and completed Mural and when it was first seen, Peggy Guggenheim reportedly wrote that it was completed and installed in November 1943. There are no conflicting records about when Pasofi was first shown. We do know that it was not finished on time to be included in the November show. Rather, it was included in a group show in Peggy's gallery in April 1944, featuring recent works by European artists like Mural, Braque, Picasso, and a few Americans such as Motherwell, Gottlieb, and Rothko. It has often been written about that Pollock's works from 1943, such as Guardians of the Secrets and The She-Wolf and The Moon Woman Cuts the Circle, integrated evocation of Native American culture and classical mythology featuring totemic figures, arrows, geometric markings, slash marks, and zigzags. Pasofi started in the fall of 43 and probably finished early 44 follows course. It also has been written about that Pollock never titled his paintings, but that titles were later added, courtesy of Lee Krasner and friends, often known to have made suggestions. Pasofi is no exception. The story goes that James Johnson Sweeney, then curator at the Museum of Modern Art, stopped by to visit Pollock in his 8th Street studio, keeping an eye on his progress for the upcoming solo show, when his eye caught sight of the painting, 4 totemic figures flanking a central oval. Inside the oval, a stick figure seems to battle a beast. As Sweeney was intently looking on, Pollock told him, "That's Moby Dick." Ignoring Pollock's comment, Sweeney reportedly shouted across the room, "Pasofi, that's Pasofi," to which Pollock answered, "Who the hell is Pasofi?" And so Sweeney went on to tell him the legend of Pasofi. She was a queen, the wife of King Minos of Crete, who due to some divine retaliation from Poseidon to Minos, became enraptured with a beautiful white bull the god had presented the king. Eventually, Pasofi and the bull's union took place, and the fruit of their union was the deadly Minotaur, a monster with the body of a man and the head of a bull. Admittedly, this is one of the more bizarre tales of ancient Greece. Clearly, the story seems to have had some resonance for Pollock, who not only retitled his painting, but went on to take copious notes about the storyline which have remained in his archive. Whether named Moby Dick or Pasofi, Pollock's composition clearly seems to capture some intense struggle emanating from the center of the composition. As we shall see later, the original center oval element referred to by Sweeney was subsequently altered. Due to its violent, erotic, and bestial aspects, This story was understandably not often represented in the history of art, except perhaps by Picasso, of course, but it played a prominent role in the works of surrealist artist André Masson between 1932 and 1945. Masson's liquefied forms achieved through automatic spilling of ink and sand were probably of interest to Pollock. Incidentally, Masson's work happened to be shown in New York in 1943. There is no doubt Sweeney would have seen this work at the time. I'm sorry. Of all the works Pollock set out to complete for his 1943 solo show, Pasofi, which is about 4.5 by 8 feet, was the largest painting of his career yet, and he was well into it that fall. But as we know, the painting was not finished on time. According to some account, Howard Putzel, Peggy Guggenheim's associate whose reputation depended on the critical and commercial success of Pollock's first solo show, was growing worried. He suddenly got nervous that no collector would gamble on such a large painting. Putzel begged Pollock to abandon the work on Pasofi and instead to focus on smaller picture that could have a better chance to attract tentative buyers. Pollock apparently obliged. In any event, it is fair to assume that the picture was probably well advanced at the time Sweeney's encounter, and Sweeney's encounter certainly indicates that. Nearly 40 years later, in 1982, Pasofi entered the Metropolitan Museum of Art when it was directly purchased from Lee Krasner, who had kept it with her all these years. Because they were painted during the same intense time period in Pollock's life, looking at Pasofi in relation to Mural was a natural comparison to make. While both works were realized under rather different circumstances. Pasofi's long gestation versus Mural's urgent delivery, both paintings share a number of technical similarities, but their differences are no less interesting in understanding Pollock's process and technique at this moment of 1943. Stylistically, the layout of Pasofi's composition is very different from Mural. The two figures on the left and possibly three figures on the right, flanking the central action, give the piece a deliberate stage design construction, which is rather different from Mural's rhythmic dancing scroll-like quality. Yet, many passages in Pasofi show a similar visual vocabulary, a fluidity, a roundness evoking the melodic rhythm, the Bentonian forms often cited, present all over Mural. And I want to bring your attention here to these leggy figures, these arabesque forms seen on the figures that are quite reminiscent in Mural. Also the kind of H shape here on its side that is so present and so prominent in the top, as well as the curly, semi-curly figures, forms here that are, of course, all over Mural. However, the sharp, angular strokes, which I call the staccato notes, mostly present at the center, are unique to Pasofi. These assertive accents give the composition a more ominous and aggressive character, perhaps. Whether it was meant to be Moby Dick's or Pasofi's, they do convey a sense of struggle. As mentioned before, the painting remained in Lee Krasner's possession until 1982, and despite its extensive exhibition history up till then, Pasofi has received minimal conservation intervention. Mostly, the painting suffered from adhesion failure between the ground and the paint layer. This is not entirely surprising due to the great variety of paint qualities and consistencies, Pollock's multi-layering technique, and the formidable weight of the paint layer pulling from the canvas and the ground layer. Extensive traveling has not been friendly to Pasofi, resulting in numerous paint losses. Fortunately for us, many losses had been well kept and documented over the years, which we were able to use for supplemental analyses. The painting provides us with an untouched support and nearly untouched surface as well, which are key to Pollock's material and practice at this pivotal time. Both the front and back of the picture provide us with valuable insights about the materials. The picture is painted on a robust linen canvas that has remained unlined and was never taken off its stretcher. And I just wanted to explain what you do see here is the reverse of the canvas, but it has a cami lining. A cami lining is a loose lining which is inserted under the stretcher bars and then stapled on the outer edge of the stretcher bars. And this is done without ever taking the canvas off its stretcher. So the cami lining provides extra support to the canvas and padding and protects against vibration when the painting is traveling. While the paint layer is often thick and multi-layered, the canvas weave can also easily be distinguished from the front. The prominent weave pattern is called a 3/2 basket weave, which Alan told you about earlier. The warp thread direction is the vertical direction. This is visually determined as the proper left edge of the canvas shows a thin strip of canvas that is unprimed. This edge is the salvage edge. Interestingly, the top edge also reveals a thin, uneven strip of unprimed canvas. However, the canvas is clearly cut off along that edge. This cut-off edge suggests that it is an edge of the canvas that would have been cut off from a larger piece of the loom and secured onto the large frame used for priming application. In other words, these features seem to indicate that the piece of canvas used for Pasofi is an end piece of a prepared roll of canvas. And I want to bring your attention here to these frames for priming. And as you see here, there's the remnant of a stripped edge of canvas after the canvas has been cut off from the frame, after the priming was done. Two faded red stencils partially visible on the back of the unlined canvas below the top stretcher bar identify the Belgian canvas manufacturer Victor Claessens. Claessens produced machine-woven canvases prepared by hand with a double ground layer of zinc and lead white, beginning in 1905, following a very traditional method. Their standard prepared canvas was over 2 meters or 84 inches wide by 11 yards and was produced until the late 1960s. They also produced an extra large canvas, 6 meters wide or about 13 feet, that was made on a hand-weaving loom and hand-prepared with a ground layer, a double ground layer, until the late 60s. Their products are still available today in different sizes. And these photographs here show the company's current canvas preparation process. The company also has a wonderful little film on their website showing this hand-woven loom that dates about probably from the 60s, and it's quite entertaining to watch. While Mural's wax lining prevents us to see the back of the canvas, the weave is also clearly visible under the painting surface, and it shows the same 3/2 basket weave pattern as Pasofi. But the horizontal direction appears to be the warp threads direction. Given that Pasofi's length is about 96 inches and that Mural's width is about the same size, one can see that the piece of canvas that could have been rotated, at a 90-degree angle. And this is the kind of situation. On a roll of canvas, as you can see, Mural could have been cut along the long signs where Pasofi would have been cut on the vertical side. In addition, the ground layer structure and composition observed for Pasofi is identical to Mural's, which is entirely consistent with the particular prepared canvas type Claessens was manufacturing in 1943, still made today, and listed as canvas number 29. Thread count analysis, a software automated program which calculates and images a complex fingerprint of the canvas weave, was performed on Pasofi's X-ray. The thread per centimeter results of both horizontal and vertical threads were entirely consistent with Claessens canvas number 29 specifications. An interesting feature revealed by the thread count analysis was a peculiar pattern present in the weave, some sort of weaving anomaly that could result either from a weaving glitch or from some foreign impression transferred to the canvas during storage. Such anomaly is referred to as a snake pattern. The research is ongoing, and we are very eager for the thread count report analysis on Mural's canvas in order to be able to definitively link the two paintings to a same roll of canvas. So stay tuned, we might have more information soon. While there are no exports from Belgium to the US during World War II, there is evidence that Belgian prime linen canvases were stocked in the 40s in New York artist supplied stores. On July 29, 1943, Pollock wrote to his brother Charles that he had stretched the canvas for Mural in his apartment, presumably from a very large roll of canvas. Reasonably, some extra canvas from the roll would have been left over, which Pollock would then use to paint other pictures for his solo show. Pasofe's canvas bears interesting marks and inscriptions. Along each side of the composition, there are straight pencil lines clearly traced before he started painting, as can be seen in these details. Additionally, a barely legible handwritten inscription in blue color reads 56 by 96, is present along the right tacking edge of the painting, which has become abraded over time. These are the actual dimensions of Pasofi. These distinct marks tell us that Pollock had a clear idea about the dimensions of this composition before he started it, and that he stayed well within them. Pollock first painted the canvas unstretched, presumably pinned to the wall. The generous dripping marks visible running vertically through the bottom tacking edge are clear evidence of this. Finally, the date of 1944 handwritten in pencil is clearly legible along the top turnover edge, which is the date listed when the painting was first exhibited in April 44 at Art of the Century Gallery. But as we know, the painting has always been dated from its origin in 1943. And as a matter of fact, the painting is signed on the face, but there is no dating on the face of the painting. As with Mural, trying to establish a consistent painting sequence for Pasofi is often challenging. Multi-layering, reworking, and changes Pollock made, principally in the center of the composition, complicate readability. By contrast, the two sides of the composition, where the standing figures are, they do not show much rework or edit from his first draft. These are the most thinly painted areas of the composition, where the layering is most legible, and areas of the ground layer have been left in reserve. These are more readily visible in the UV photograph, as indicated by the arrows. Examination shows that Pollock made his first outline with a dark bluish green color or teal color, reinforced by ultramarine blue and other mixed blue outlines. Broad shapes were often fleshed out with complementary colors. A light purple color underlines the preliminary features, which are then roughly filled in with a color we came to call mustard color. As we will see later, these two-tone prevalent in the composition are complex mixtures combining numerous pigments. These foundation colors used to build the composition's main design are fluidly applied with a large soft brush, lacking apparent brush marks. This is very reminiscent of Mural's overall paint application. As we know, Pollock painted Pasofi over an extended period of time, leaving it aside for a while in order to focus on smaller works for his show. So one does expect to see wet on dry paint application as seen on the right. In contrast, the center of the composition, where the action is, was most rework in the later stage, and this is where we find the most wet in wet application as seen on the left. Numerous accent colors come on top to which further underline, supplement, and or modify the main shapes, such as the green, the yellow, the white, the red strokes, all of which, seen on the right, have been identified as single pigment planes. These bright accents are applied very broadly, mostly applied with a thin brush. But in many places, Pollock seems to have squeezed the paint directly out of the tube onto the surface. These impastos are narrow but thick and meaty and give the piece a forceful three-dimensionality. This is not something we necessarily see in Mural. For instance, Pollock painted full accent colors just like this, but they're usually more thinly applied. Yet, as in Mural, the thick, dark outlines solidifying the main shape stand out from the surface and lock in the composition. They appear to be almost black, but are actually a very deep shade of purple and were added later on. In Mural, Pollock painted the dark outlines both early and late using different colors, as we've seen, some umber and blue combination. As seen in murals and other works painted in 1943, such as the She-Wolf Guardians of the Secrets, Pollock used a middle gray color in a rather idiosyncratic manner. This is the gray we have come to call the editing gray, with which Pollock made his final editing either to erase or refine in order to define a new background form from which elements are coming forward or receding. As in Mural, the tone is a combination of all the paints Pollock used in his painting, a sort of melting pot of all the pigments. The other strikingly similar element of the last applications to the paint layer is, of course, the delicate skeins of purple paint, which are so incongruous, barely noticeable, yet so prominently thrown at the exact center of Pasofi. This wonderful paint-throwing experiment shown in one of the Getty's exhibition film perfectly illustrates that this could have been done vertically. It could well have been done, it could well have been executed, it could well have been executed, it could well have been executed similarly here, especially given that there is evidence Pollock made more editing after the purple drip was applied, as you can see on the left. However, there is no definitive last color being used. Till the end, Pollock worked with the editing gray and other white, red, and umber accent back and forth. An X-ray of the painting was also very revealing about Pasofi's development. A strong image of the composition design comes through regardless the layers of paint. The most discernible feature is the oval shape, which Sweeney had referred to when he first saw the painting in Pollock's studio. It fills out the center, flanked by another smaller oval shape to the right, as well as 5 egg-like ovals right in the center. I'm not entirely sure how to interpret these egg shapes, however, perhaps for the rhythmic repetition Pollock was exploring at the time. However, this prominent roundness present early on was either obliterated, transformed, or edited later. Pollock broke the oval center shape by applying the editing gray paint roughly all around the line, as one would use an eraser. As we see it now, the angular accents on top of the oval have given the composition a different energy. An interesting feature revealed in the X-ray relates to Pollock's technique in the early development of the composition. A network of scoring lines fill out the upper part of the large oval, which is now completely invisible because it has been covered by multiple paint layers. These sgraffito lines could be interpreted as an attempt to erase his previous layers, possibly. But such assertive gestural features immediately call to mind Pollock's future action painting technique. A rough tracing of the scoring lines show a more immediate relationship with some of the screen print Pollock was doing in 1943. The Metropolitan scientists Julia Zlanorlu and Sylvia Centeno performed pigment and medium analyses on samples specifically taken in relation to Mural in order to draw comparisons with the paints and pigments used by Pollock in 1943. As mentioned earlier, the ground layer is identical in both paintings. Cross-sections show a same double ground structure and have the same composition of a thick layer of zinc white at the bottom and a thin layer of lead white on top. All paints in Pasofis are linseed oil base. And as in Mural, with a few exceptions, the paints identified suggest that Pollock palette was an artist paint based rather than commercial or industrial based. Not surprisingly, the white pigments are identical, transparent zinc white, opaque titanium, but unlike in Mural, no casein paint was found in any of the white paints used in Pasofi. Pollock used the fast-drying casein retail trade paint to put in the mid-process touches to redefine the forms before he could continue on to paint the later stage of the composition. There was no such mid-stage with Pasofi, which probably explained why we did not see such paint. Bright yellows were pure pigment, cadmium yellow and lead chromate, but the mustard yellow showed to be a more complex mixture of yellow, red, blue, and white. For the reds, Cadmium red, pure and mixed with white, was identified, but the most interesting paint we found, which is very scarcely applied, is a mixture of cochineal and shellac. It has the most interesting day glow-like fluorescence under UV, as seen on the right. Pasofe's signature blue is ultramarine, as opposed to Mural's cerulean, but mixtures of ultramarine and phthalo blue and green were found especially in the prominent turquoise mixtures. As in Mural, phthalo green and viridian were consistently used. There are numerous variations of the purple shade all over the composition. Different organic red colorant mixed with inorganic pigments such as alizarin lake for the dark purples were found to be mixtures. Yes, I have to wrap it up. I have a lot more to say, but I will stop now. So I think we'll have to have a further session on all these comparatives. We also did micro XRF, and we have very preliminary results, but we're looking forward to study the fully processed files, and they will probably, no doubt, give us a lot more information for future. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I just want to say that I'm honored to be here at the occasion of the unveiling of Mural and the extraordinary presentation of the painting, which I hope all of you will see in the galleries. I am here not as a Pollock scholar in any way, but to represent a number of colleagues in the Guggenheim Foundation, which includes the SRGM Solomon R. Guggenheim in New York and the Peggy Guggenheim Collection in Venice. I'm also here representing colleagues at the Opificio delle Pietre Dure in Florence, who are working with us on a Pollock project, and a scientific group known as Charisma, who are based in Perugia, Italy. And I know I have far too much material and I have very little time, so I'm going to give you an overview of a project which we have embarked upon about a year ago in the Palazzo Veniere dei Leoni, which you see here up on the screen, which is the Peggy Guggenheim Collection on the Grand Canal in Venice. The works that we're studying became part of the Guggenheim Foundation in 1979 at the time of Peggy's death. And I believe they provide a nice context for the period directly before and after the mural, and that's why I think it's important to see the whole progression. The works range from 1942 to 1947, a period of transformation and development toward Pollock's more renowned and better known all-over painting, or so-called drip painting. So these works will elucidate Pollock's development from a Cubist and Surrealist-inspired iconography towards his more personal expressive practice that appears by 1947, and that will be the main subject, if I get to it, of my talk, which is Alchemy from 1947, which we're in the process of studying and treating right now. And there is Peggy in front of Alchemy. Pollock's relationship with Peggy, as you know, as an avid supporter and patron, was crucial to his development and his eventual renown as one of the most important painters of the 20th century. Peggy hosted 3 solo shows of his works at her Art of the Century gallery in New York before she moved to Venice in the late 40s. At the same time, during this period, Pollock moves from his New York studio to Long Island along the Abaconic Creek in Northampton. In this period, he moves from small easel paintings with figurative imagery towards larger abstract paintings executed on the floor. So Peggy moves to Venice in around 1949, and in 1950, she exhibits 23 works by Pollock in the Museo Correr. So over the years of these 23 paintings, a number of them were donated to various institutions, one of them being Mural to Yale and then Iowa. And these 10 works that you see on the screen are what remains in the collection today. I have been combing some of the literature from some of my colleagues who are here today, Susan Lake, who will speak afterwards, Carol Mancusi-Ungaro, Jim Coddington, and of course Kirk Varnado, Pepe Carmel, who were all part of the 1980 1949 retrospective of Pollock. And in Kirk's essay, Open-Ended Conclusions, he notes that these pictures of this period had fallen out of favor and that during the retrospective they were being reconsidered in the context of a larger whole. And he called it a singular chapter in a broader history. Looking at these paintings, I see this sort of oscillation back and forth. It's not a linear progression. It's a time of turbulent expression, unlimited experimentation. He's reflecting on many of his interests, and you'll see as I quickly go through these that you're going to find Cubist abstraction, Mexican surrealism, his interest in Native American ritual, totemic, shamanic, and Jungian, perhaps, type symbolism. So it's leading into a new pictorial moment that would become all over abstraction, but it's certainly not a linear progression. And in the end, we'll find the poured and dripped surfaces that you're most familiar with. So in the spring of 2013, a study of all the paintings in the Peggy collection was launched by Luciano Pensabeni, my colleague in Venice, and it was in collaboration with the Charisma Group and their MoLab portable laboratory. I'm not going to go into the science of this, but I wanted just to give a nod to these scientists who are studying through non-destructive analytical techniques that they've developed for studying cultural heritage, where they come with a portable lab and they can see a range of techniques, identify materials without taking samples. So we have quite a bit of information from the work that they have done, and these are all the various analyses that are doing, which I am not going to go into an explanation of, but they are able to a certain extent identify pigments, identify binders, although in some cases we do need to take samples in order to be definitive and specific, and we're also working on a number of imaging techniques for the various works. So I'm going to start from 1942, La Donna Luna, or the Moon Woman, from the Peggy collection, a figurative work, which we saw earlier today, obvious relation to Picasso, Mural, surrealism. You see a very brightly colored palette with very thin washes of dilute paint, as well as scumbled and direct brushwork. Again, these reserves that everyone is talking about, he leaves the ground visible in many areas, using that as part of the composition. And you also see some very early drippy dilute paint that you'll see much more of in the later years. So the work, of course, has been related to Jungian theory and the unconscious, the totemic and the ritualistic symbolism with the moon as woman. In order to achieve this, you have fairly rapid application of paint, sometimes frenetic scribbled forms, especially when he's doing these sort of totemic, perhaps Native American type symbols on the left. They're squiggly lines and dots creating these patterns. And of course you see this dark line, which is the armature of the figure. The woman is seen both frontally and to the side, of course a nod to Picasso. And at this point, we're in 1942, the approach to painting is fairly traditional. You might even see a little bit of divisionist or impressionistic brushstroke over here. It's a vertical orientation and very painterly. In terms of condition, the painting has some serious issues that need to be addressed, and they are related to the mural in a certain sense because a varnish was put on it sometime in the past. And I think that you can see here in this photo, this is also somewhat specular, so that you can see the sort of grayish film that you're looking at when you look at the painting. And hopefully we will be able to remove that and bring back a more variegated, beautiful palette. 1943, this says 1944, sorry. I have 1943 here, but this is untitled, sometimes called Don Quixote. Of course, we had a long talk yesterday about figures, not figures. Of course, you see a figure of a horse and a rider, perhaps. What's interesting, I think, here is there is this arabesque that you see over and over and over in these early works that defines the head of any type of figure. And he uses this convention repeatedly. And one of the more interesting things, this is a very, very small and not so well-known picture, but he's starting to use what we see in later works as a scribbling back into wet paint, so a subtraction technique where he takes the end of his brush or a sharp tool and he works back into a wet paint film. Here is 2, which was painted over the course of, we think, 43 to 45. Again, you see here clear totemic figures. There's a woman and a man, and perhaps the activity of sexual encounter in the center. Mythical symbols, calligraphy, a relatively muted palette, and I see a relationship perhaps to the Demoiselle d'Avignon by Picasso. He's defining the figures with black contours, but he is coming back again. This theme comes back over and over again of the masking, or taking a gray, in this case a gray tonality, and coming back, subtracting the composition, reworking it, and using this actually to define space and form. And actually, I think this was to create a more abstracted form of these bodies. There's some speculation here because of the material characteristics that this gray paint is a house paint. And that is also, it's also visible, it's quite fluid, and there's this nice little drip you can see, I believe, right here. Moving on to Direction, which is a 1945 very playful picture. I immediately think of Klee when I look at this, and perhaps his relationship to Hayter. What's most interesting about this, and I'm trying to give you some look into all the various types of applications of paint that you see over this period from 42 to 47, which will then culminate in an amalgam, as you see with Alchemy later on. And in this particular work, interestingly, he was working from dark to light. There's a reddish type ground underneath the surface, which is a very traditional method of working. And what we haven't seen too much of at this point is this tube that he's using. These are not brush strokes. This is directly from the tube, just taking the tube and placing the white paint on the surface. So the figure, let's talk about the figure perhaps for a bit. Although there's been a whole lot of discussion in the art historical world about Jungian therapy and the unconscious, Pollock doesn't acknowledge this reference directly, but he does say that he paints from his unconscious, and that, quote, figures were bound to emerge. So I think throughout this period we're seeing figures over and over again. I've spent many hours watching contemporary dance and bodies moving through space, so I tend to see dance in everything that Pollock does. But I think there's also this consistent appearance of certain symbols: the moon, the sun, eyes, serpents, birds, mandalas. And I think all of these earlier works speak to his interest in these Native American rituals, classical mythology, and some of the earlier references to Thomas Hart Benton and the Mexican surrealists. So we're working forward, gradual abstraction, abstracted forms. The figures start to disappear. And as in Mural, they become abstracted, they're reworked until they sort of dissipate. And within 2 years from this painting, we will find that they disappear completely, although that is also in contention in some arenas. So here we see circumcision, which I think in some ways is related quite closely to Pasofi. And You see this dense composition, a buildup of surface. There's a certain aggressive, ritualistic attitude. You see sharp curve, and you see sharp angular lines as opposed to curves. There's an imagery of war and violence, knives and swords. And he achieves this, though, with this very brightly colored palette. Also, a wide range of tools are used in this particular application. He's using the brush. He's also using tubes, directly squeezing tubes onto the picture, very high impasto, and he's working and reworking the composition. You see also the same visible ground in areas where he decides to rest. And in other places, you see very quick strokes of paint, scribbling, sort of totemic warrior-type images, eyes and masks throughout. And it's painted in a very rapid manner, almost if it's pouring from some inner impulse or the unconscious. So although I think he was very aware of what he could do with his materials, I get the sense that when he's painting, he is in a blissful state, perhaps that he wasn't in his regular day-to-day daily life, and it becomes a very joyful experience in many ways. This particular painting also has conservation issues. It has a lucite 44 synthetic varnish on it, which is doing a similar thing to what happened to the mural, flattening the space and creating a film between the viewer and the very energetic paint film. And that's just another detail of two things, which you see is the leaving the white ground visible as part of the composition, and then these quick scribbles which really look sort of like Native American symbols on rugs and various decorative patterns. So moving on to 1946, here we have Bird Effort, a small work which clearly is very abstracted, but of course, we still see the bird, the image of the bird, which we've seen over and over again in various compositions. You see the black armature, the black delineation of the forms, which very soon will become poured lines, skeins of paint. But this is still work that he's doing in Northampton on the second floor of the house that they purchased, and it's a very small bedroom where he's working, so he doesn't have a lot of space. He doesn't have the option to work on a very large scale. There's some speculation that he already worked somewhat on the floor up there in the small bedroom studio, but that is, I don't think, has been confirmed. But up there in that bedroom, he started this Sounds in the Grass series. Oh dear, okay. So I'm gonna go through this quickly because here you see he's moving into abstraction, although you still have eyes. This is eyes in the heat, and you see eyes all over the composition. But he's using these lyrical arabesques and creating texture with the tube, the spatula, the brush, and the movement. So I'm coming to Alchemy, which is really the subject of our focus right now. That is the final work, which I'm not going to deal with at all. But here is Pollock in his studio working on Alchemy. We believe that Alchemy is one of the first, if not the first painting where he is directly on the floor. He moves out to the barn studio at a certain point in 47 after it becomes warm because they don't have heat in the barn, and so we're assuming this is the summer of 47. What's extremely interesting is that he is using this structure, which he writes to his mother in 1947. I have a painting stretched on the quilting frame, hope to have it finished in another week, and then send the frame on to you. So ultimately, he will be working directly on the floor, but in this case, because I think it's one of the very first pictures that goes to the floor, He perhaps needs this, this is speculation, but perhaps he needs the crutch of this loom so that he can put it vertically and horizontally. There is some indication that he was working with a brush early on, and then later he's pouring, dripping. In Kirk Varnado's essay, he speaks of a quote from Terry Winters, where he said there was 7 or 8 paintings trying to get out. And I think in some ways, Alchemy really, really elucidates this, because there is so much paint on the surface of this work. And so he's using the loom. He talks about that. This is the barn where he's working outside of the house. And here's the floor many, many years later. And I think that you could see when he was working on the floor, there's no paint on the floor. So this is a very, very early. I need to wrap it up. So I just wanted to show you a little bit. There's a tremendous amount of texture and sand and pebbles in the work that we're working on in Alchemy 1947. So here's Pollock working in his studio, putting wet paint down and then pouring the sand into the wet paint. And here are some Native Americans working, interesting enough, very constricted, not nearly as open gestural as Pollock is working, but some of the iconography is interesting in terms of the earlier pictures. So here's a raking light photo of how much paint is built up on this surface. What's interesting, though, is that this is not a commercial priming. This is a priming that he put on himself, and he starts at this time to leave areas of the raw canvas all the way around. You see some of the canvas weave, and I really want to get to the canvas, so I'm going to go through these details just so you have a little bit of an idea of what he was doing. Wet on wet. We have alkyd paints starting to appear at this time. Tremendous amount of texture. We have 3 different types of whites. We have this titanium white. We have this beige, what we believe to be, it's sort of, I don't think this is done in really specific phases, although I think he came back over and over because there's not a lot of wet on wet in this picture, but there's a beige-like house paint that defines some form. Again, this is also a moment of great transition because he's using aluminum paint, which is something that we don't believe he's used in the past. I'm going to have to go quickly through this. One side, sorry. There's the tacking edge. One side actually shows you the fabric, and the other side is clear that he had to make a decision compositionally of where he was going to cut that painting when he took it off that loom. And this is something that I think is fabulously interesting. We have not completed the research on this, but I also wanted to put this out to the room because we haven't been able to find anything similar. This painting is painted on what we believe to be something like a printed tablecloth. And at first you think, oh, this is just the oil coming through from the front to the back. But when we started to look closely, this fabric is actually a very, very thin, what seems to be a linen tablecloth, and the printed pattern is on the front. So when you're talking about how Pollock is in dialogue with what comes before, he started this with a canvas that has like a vase of flowers, a pattern that repeats over and over again, and that's what he was looking at when he first started the painting, which I think is fascinating. And the other thing that's fascinating is there seems to be a similar type fabric here hanging on the wall, so we're looking for that. I have to stop now, but I just wanted to show you where Alchemy is. It is now at the Opificio, and here it is, and the wall of our little studio where we're working is in fact the Leonardo da Vinci Adoration of the Magi. So it's quite an extraordinary juxtaposition and a very exciting collaborative project with the Opificio. And here's many of our colleagues from the Opificio pouring over the surface of Alchemy. We're doing tests to determine how to clean this work, which in 67 years has not been cleaned and has a tremendous buildup of dirt, dust, some mold, crystals growing. I think you can see here that this is over the entire surface, this type of dirt and grime. So it will be a very, very satisfying treatment. Here you see a small cleaning test. On the right it's clean, on the left it's not clean. So it's just dirt and grime. One last thing. This is the X-radiograph, and I want you to think about Mural and some of the earlier works. This is the lead white paint that Pollock is using to prime the canvas. So it's gestural. There's these circular form, these semicircular forms that he's putting on with a spatula very sort of aggressively, and it almost has a futuristic quality to it. We haven't quite figured out what the relationship of this is to the final composition, because you don't really see the ground layer, but we do know that was either an earlier painting or that he was blocking in this sort of frenetic overall picture that he would end up creating in the end in 1947. And there it is with the Leonardo and Luciano, who will be working on the painting. And I'd just like to thank you for your attention. Thank you so much.
I too would like to thank the Getty for the opportunity to present the results of my work, but also for the opportunity to see Mural. The results of this study was first presented almost 10 years ago and was prompted by the 1998 Jackson Pollock retrospective at MoMA. My focus has been primarily on pigment and medium analysis, not the stratigraphy or the order of paint application. But it has been somewhat gratifying to see that many of the results that I came up with those many years ago have been confirmed by the work being done here as well as at MoMA. I apologize ahead of time for some of the slides because they were scanned, poorly scanned, from 35 millimeter slides, which gives you an idea of how long ago some of this research was done. Jackson Pollock, as you know, first gained much of his notoriety with the general public as a result of a 1949 article published in Life magazine entitled, "Is He the Greatest Living Painter in the United States?" The first page, which you see here. The images that accompanied this, the often bemused text of the article, helped establish the concept that Pollock's pictures were unedited states of raw emotion. Even the most supportive critics of the time tended to interpret his works as heedless surrender to accident, the products of mindless spontaneity without preconception or planning. Pollock himself, the statements of the time indicate that he resented the assumption that his paintings were arbitrarily made, that his technique was chaotic and without discipline. In 1950, for example, he stated that with experience, it seems possible to control the flow of paint, end quote. Scholars now generally acknowledge that there is a certain amount of control evident in his methods of applying his paints. Reassessment of Pollock's working methods has only recently extended to a discussion of the actual paints he used. Previously, the perception was not far from Axel Horn's 1935 description of Pollock in the Siqueiros experimental workshop, where he reports, and quote, "In his frenetic efforts at realization, Pollock would use anything within reach," end quote. Most contemporary publications on Pollock continue to describe his work simply as commercial, broadly listed as duco, lacquer, enamel, and metallic. And by the way, I'm following what a number of the speakers said earlier. When I mention commercial paints or retail trade paints, I mean house paints, those bought in paint stores or hardware stores and used to coat architectural structures, furniture, signs, etc. Pollock himself never spoke specifically about the paints that he was using, other than to say that he, quote, preferred a liquid flowing kind of paint. Lee Krasner, Pollock's wife, provided more specific information about her husband's paints. In an interview after his death, she reported that sometime in the late 40s, he began to use commercial paints. She also recalled that DuPont Company made up very special paints for him. She later identified Pollock's paints by their brand names, Duco and DeVoe and Reynolds. Duco was the trade name of cellulose nitrate-based enamel paint made by DuPont. Frequent descriptions of Pollock's paints as Duco, along with photographs that often show cans with Duco labels, have led to the assumption that the artist extensively used cellulose nitrate paints, often referred to as peroxylin, in his drip or poured paintings of his mature style. This study of Pollock's paints of works executed between 1943 and 50 indicates that the artist's working methods, his materials, and decisions made while painting, although spontaneous to a degree and always involving a margin of accident, were not completely impulsive. Rather, they're based on his growing experience with his application methods and with the properties of the paints that he was selecting. Certainly, the development of his drip and pour paintings was more complex than the mere adoption of house paints that he dripped from cans. Examination of composition with pouring two, painted in 1943, and the earliest painting that we analyzed, reveals an apparent freedom in the application of paint. In places, it was poured so that it formed strips and puddles. But dripped paint is only one of several techniques employed. In this work, as in Mural, Pollock combined traditional methods and materials with more conventional ones. He began the work by first brushing on swirls of white, yellow, blue, a reddish brown, green, and black artist oil paints to a stretcher that already had been mounted to a painting that had already been mounted to a stretcher and that was primed with a double white lead ground. Over this, he brushed. Over these brush-applied layers, he laid in ribbons of cadmium oil paint that he, just as in previous has been cited, likely squeezed directly from the opening of a tube. The paints that I've discussed so far, based on the direction of flow on the tacking edges, were very likely applied with a canvas in a vertical position. Finally, over the brush-applied layers and the orange, and with the canvas in a horizontal position, Pollock splashed on two more paints, both of them highly diluted. One is a white, and the other is a glossy black. The dripped white is an oil-based paint that may be either a house paint or an artist's paint based on the pigments found, titanium and zinc. Only the glossy black drip paint is definitely a retail trade paint made from a mixture of drying oil and a large amount of colophony, or pine resin. Such a mixture, often termed an oleoresinous paint, was sold as an inexpensive enamel paint, usually recommended to be restricted for interior use. Cross-sections of this work, although this work looks like it was rapidly executed, cross-sections, just as in the case with Mural, show that the work probably or had to have been executed over extended periods of time. Each paint layer had dried before subsequent layers were applied. Like Mural, the imagery of There Were 7 and 8, executed approximately of 1945, is a complex composite of brushstrokes, dabs, smears, and spatters. The loosely delineated forms were all applied with a brush. However, analysis of these paints indicates they're now a combination of retail trade paints and artist oils. The greenish yellow and beige paints are very likely house paints based on their pigment composition. The yellow is an aerolide PY3. It was a pigment that was not available in artist oils until later. That of the beige is interesting. Like that in Mural, it's a lithopone and clay composition. And these relatively cheap, colorless pigments were only employed usually as fillers and not as the primary pigment. The medium of both paints are drying oils. So although I have to say it would be interesting to reanalyze the beige paint because it's honeycombed with holes. And we did analyze for protein, but it was a scanning method. So it'd be interesting to re-look at that beige paint, given the fact that casein was identified in Mural. By contrast, the binding media of the purple, the blue, and a lighter yellow are linseed oil mixed with castor oil, a blend of oils found in artists' tube paints of the time. That of the heavily impastoed white paint is walnut oil, and this white paint exists across the surface of the painting. Walnut oil is a relatively expensive binding medium, and therefore this is very likely also a tube paint. The looping lines in glossy black paint were applied late in the composition. They initially, from a distance, look poured, but they're all applied with a flat filbert-type brush. This paint has a pigment composition of bone black and viridian in a linseed oil binder, indicating that it was a paint that the artist mixed himself from tube paints. No cross-sections were taken of this work. However, much of the composition appears to have been applied wet in wet, that is, with a blending of the paints directly on the surface, suggesting that much of the painting was executed in a short burst of time. The final drip, or at least towards the end, final drip spatters in red, yellow, green, and blue, cadmium red, cadmium yellow, cerulean, and viridian, are all artist tube paints that Pollock must have diluted to a liquid consistency before flicking or dripping them onto the paint surface. Just as there is not a linear progression in Pollock's work from figuration to abstraction, there's not a straight line in his use of his artist's materials. Shimmering Substance, painted in 1946, a year after the work I just discussed, is a highly textured painting in yellow, orange, green, light blue, with no areas of drip paint. These paints, which you see here in detail, appear all to have been applied with a stiff brush, a palette knife, or to have been squeezed directly from a paint tube. And based on pigment and medium analysis, this painting appears to have been painted exclusively with artist oil paints, high-quality artist oil paints, as was Water Figure of 1945. It's not until about 1947, 3 years after Mural and composition with pouring 2 was executed. And it's at this time that he seems to more extensively rely on retail trade paints that were dripped and poured. Full Fathom 5 of 1947, which you see here, represents a full-fledged breakthrough in Pollock's dripped and poured technique, as does Alchemy, which Carol just discussed. Yet even in this case, it's an elaboration of methods that he had used earlier. Over a lower, possibly figural painting in artist oil, Pollock dripped and poured paints in dark blue, orange, green, silver, and a matte and glossy black. These upper or more recently applied paint layers dominate the composition, and they are all retail trade paints. Both the matte and glossy backs are oleoresinous paints, then are a drying oil mixed with colophony. The silver-colored paint, which you see here, is aluminum powder in linseed oil binder. Krasner recalled that Pollock began to use this commercial paint in 1947. Such a paint was commonly sold as a radiator paint used to coat heaters and pipes. The splashes of dark blue, and these are where the slides are not very good, dark blue, dark orange, green are all oil-modified resin paints. The earliest examples of these recently marketed house paints that we found in a painting by Pollock. Near the end of the execution of this work, the artist applied parallel daubs in orange near the top right corner and highly impasteled white that is spread across this surface. And these both are definitely artist paints, likely applied directly from the tube or with a fine brush. Number 1A of 1948, the largest painting to date by Pollock, executed in the drip-poured manner, is the first work by Pollock where it is evident that in order to make it, he had to involve his entire body. As with Full Fathom 5, Pollock's use of poured drip paints is an important element of the composition, but it's only one of several techniques that he employed to make this picture. As will be discussed later, he began it by smearing, scumbling a matte black and a purple paint onto the unstretched, unprimed canvas using his hands, a broad brush, and the open end of a paint tube. The binding medium of both of these paints, the black and purple that is, are a mixture of drying oil and castor oil. Again, a mixture that would have only been found in tube paints of the time. Over this initial layer, he dripped on an open network of black, cream, and silver paints that were all applied wet in wet, and these are all retail trade paints. The black is an oleoresinous paint, as before. The cream-colored paint is an oil-modified alkyd. The silver is aluminum in linseed oil, identical in its composition to that in the radiator paint found in Full Fathom 5. Near the end, he applied long, slender tadpole shapes in orange, yellow, white, and blue. These all, again, are all artist tube paints, as indicated by pigment and medium analysis. These tadpoles were probably not done from the opening in the tube, but likely made when the artist put a hole in the body of the tube and created a spurt to make the head and an extended pull to create a long tail. Number 3, Tiger, and other poured paintings of 1949-50 illustrates again the radical breakthrough in Pollock's technique. He began this painting by pouring an initial tightly woven or curved design in black oleoresinous paint, so dilute that it absorbed directly into the unprimed, unstretched fabric. Over this initial layer, he dripped colored paints in orange, silver, yellow, rust, green, white, and black, all applied wet in wet, as is the case with 1A. With the exception of the silver colored paint, which is again a radiator type paint, these paints are all oil-modified alkyds. Pollock then applied a final network, or near final network, of white tadpole-like shapes in a similar manner to those applied in number 1A. The binding medium of this paint is poppy seed oil, and clearly an artist's oil paint. Analysis of additional paintings executed in 49 and 50 confirms Pollock's extensive use by 1949 of a range of retail trade paints, especially the oil-modified alkyds. All of the paints in number 12 of 49 are oil-modified alkyds. 6 of the 7 samples from number 10, 1949, and analyzed by Richard Newman, are alkyd-based paints. The other is an artist's oil. 3 samples taken from number 31 of 1950, were also identified as oil-modified alkyds. Jim and Jennifer are going to speak more fully on this painting. We had to be very careful when sampling it because it, even at that point, it looked as if it had been extensively overpainted. These are details of that work. Analysis of the paints of Lavender Mist of 1950 confirms that Pollock was using retail trade paints extensively during this phase of his career. 6 samples taken from the painting were taken from the painting. 2, the turquoise and beige, are oil-modified alkyds. The cream and pink paints are clearly house paints. based on their pigment composition. But in this case, it's interesting that they're not alkyds, but oleoresinous paints made from heat-bodied linseed oil and pine resin. It's unusual to find an oleoresinous paint in a light-colored paint because the medium tends to yellow significantly over time. The glossy black paint is also an oleoresinous paint, although the drying oil has not yet been identified and analysis is ongoing. The more heavily applied impastoed white is, again, an artist's tube paint based on the identification of the pigment as either poppy seed or linseed oil. Only one example of cellulose nitrate-based paints have been found in the paintings that we included in this study. It's a red in number 1A, and it's a minor color in the composition. Tom Lerner, however, identified cellulose nitrate paints in 5 of the 9 samples taken from blue poles, painted in 1952, relatively late in Pollock's career. As you can see here. With few notable exceptions, the prevalence of alkyd-type paints in many of Pollock's works, executed beginning with about 1949, could be explained by the fact that DuPont archival records show that by the mid-1940s, Duco was in fact no longer pure peroxylin, but was being combined with alkyd resins that were being used as plasticizers. And by the late 1940s, Duco had discontinued their production of cellulose nitrate paints and was producing oil-modified alkyd resin paints exclusively. The DeVoe and Reynolds archival records, unfortunately, are no longer available. Identification of the paints in the works included in this study correlates nicely with the selection of paints currently on display at the Krasner Pollock studio that are thought to have been used by Pollock. In addition to tube paints, which you see here in one of the slides that Carol showed you, we analyze 19 cans in a range of colors. 11 of those 19 paints were identified as oil-modified alkyds. 2 cans are oleoresinous paints. 4 are cellulose nitrate alkyd mixtures, likely the plasticized cellulose nitrate lacquers that I discussed earlier. Of 2 of these cellulose nitrate paints, 2 are identical blue cans and with synthetic ultramarine, and may possibly be the paint that was used for blue poles. The medium of 2 of the paints was unidentified. In conclusion, this study reveals the degree to which the development of Pollock's style is not a linear one. Prior to 1947, he seems to have been experimenting with a variety of paints and methods of applying them. His earliest paintings that include elements of drip paint were executed largely in artist oils. In some cases, the elements of dripped retail trade paints were added only after a lower composition in artist oils was completed. In other cases, the drip paints were actually diluted artist oils that were applied over elements executed in both house paint and artist oils. But by 1947-48, when Pollock is said to have developed his mature style using poured dripped house paint, the compositions are in fact a mixture of artist paints applied with brushes, often squeezed from tubes, but the drip poured areas dominate the compositions, and these are all executed in a range of retail trade paints, with the oil-modified alkyds being most prevalent. And this, of course, reflects what was happening in the paint industry. It's interesting to speculate that the oil-modified alkyds that Krasner described as the very special paints that were provided to Pollock were in fact the oil-modified alkyds, but DuPont has no record of an exchange between Pollock and any of their sales representatives. In any event, this study of the development of Pollock's dripped and poured paintings contradict the widely held perception of the time that he was grabbing anything within reach. His choice of materials was inspired by the aesthetic qualities he sought and his developing sensitivity to the physical properties of the various paints that he had available to him. Thank you.
I think this is more of a question for Carol and Susan with your sort of surveys of other Pollock works, but Isabelle, don't feel left out. I think one of the things that's come up in the discussions about mural in general over the last year and a half, 2 years, is the scale of this painting almost necessitated or facilitated experimentation from Pollock with application process, perhaps, materials, perhaps. But do you get the sense of where mural fits into the paintings before and after, that most of those application procedures had been sort of tried out before, in other words, or was he actually really using that paint to experiment certain things?
Go ahead.
I think it was interesting to see the poured painting from 1943 that Susan showed that actually seems to have been horizontal.
Absolutely.
I think he's trying all kinds of things. What I do think, and I think yesterday your presentations elucidated the fact that he was not comfortable with the scale of mural. I mean, I think it ended up being a great success, but I think in some ways it's a bit less experimental because he was struggling with the scale. And I think this whole idea of the figure and how he abstracts the figure as he's moving across, I think it was much more about gesture and his body. But interestingly enough, the body then becomes so important later on. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I think he was experimenting all along with all kinds of
I should
things.
interject here that, which I didn't say, is that composition with pouring two is actually a relatively small painting. It would have been easy to put it horizontal, whereas in mural, it's been pointed out, it would have been virtually impossible.
Mm-hmm.
But, and therefore, to follow up, Susan, do you think, I was wondering, which came first, the horizontal or the industrial commercial paint, whether it was the same time? Do you think there are clues in that painting that might indicate that it was a...
Well, there was only one example of commercial paint, and that's the last paint applied. And there are discussions of Pollock's experimentation with other artists of the time of using commercial paints. Even one point, there's a discussion where they melted down vinyl records and poured those. So it was in the air. It was being done by a lot of people at that time.
Yeah.
I think with the Peggy pictures, though, we do see 47 is when we're really seeing the use of house paint and the aluminum paint and the commercial. He's exploiting the properties of those paints.
Yeah, and that's what the medium analysis shows too. Is 47's the breakthrough.
Yeah.
It seems to be the breakthrough year.
Okay, we have a couple of questions. Good. We'll take this one. Yes, please.
Yes. In the movie, there were periods they showed where he was drinking very heavily and then other periods when he wasn't drinking at all. Do any of the stylistic changes correspond with any of this, or was it just kind of ongoing?
I really couldn't answer that, but you're right that he did go on the wagon. He had a therapist for a number of years that was very helpful in. But to be honest, I don't see a lot of differentiation. And perhaps I'm not a psychiatrist, but perhaps he didn't drink and paint, who knows? But I don't think there's a big difference in the styles during those periods.
We have one more question up here.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Charles. It's been interesting to hear about how the creation myth has been debunked through the analysis as for Mural, that it wasn't just painted in one night, that it was over a period of time. And then I was also surprised to learn about his show in November, that obviously he had a body of work to show. So given that Mural was perhaps painted over a series of months, does it seem that there were other paintings that he was working on at the same time? And if that's so, how do you think multiple paintings might have affected his work on Mural, both stylistically as well as his material choices for paint?
Isabelle, do you want to start us off?
Well, I think I was trying to show some of the similarities stylistically that we can observe on Pasofi, which he did paint precisely, probably around the very same time. He was trying to achieve a certain amount of paintings for the show, and he had this huge looming commission all within the same month. So between July, say maybe June, and until November, he's really busy working. Now, as I mentioned, he puts away Pasofi because I think the pressure of having to, he really wants to finish Mural. I think it's such a big deal. It's his first commission. He's got to do it. But I think I want to see some similarities, in the gestures, in the colors, of course, and in the applications. I mean, as we see over and over again, we've been trying to identify, how he starts to outlines, drafting his composition, and then fill in, and then stops, and then come back and stop. I think there's a lot. I think he was working on a lot of things at the same time, and he kind of stopped and started.
It'd be interesting. I'm recalling the MoMA show. I think some of the most adventuresome or most intriguing abstract works actually took place around this period of time, and they tended to be smaller. So perhaps he was willing to be a little more adventuresome when the scale was smaller. I'm speaking, and Jim can attest to this, a lot of those are black and white, and black bleeding into a wet white, and white bleeding into a black. And those are intriguing paintings, and I don't think they've been analyzed.
Okay, we have to break for lunch now. Whatever that was. Wasn't me. You worried about me. Andrew wants to say something? So, if we can be back at 2:15 from lunch, that would be great. And anything else to say? No? Great. See you after lunch. Thank you.